Thrilling Stories of the Railway by V. L. Whitechurch. Cases from the private notebook of Thorpe Hazell, book collector, railway enthusiast, and gentleman of independent means. Hazell often said the most daring case he ever undertook was that of the German dispatch box. Hazell was only halfway through breakfast at his house in Netherton when Moyston Cotterell, Under Secretary for Foreign Affairs, was ushered in. He was a tall, thin man, suffering from want of sleep.
"It's years since we met," he began, "and you have gained quite a reputation since college days."
"Ah, you've read my monograph on nerve culture and rational food," replied Hazell.
"No," said Cotterell. "I mean your reputation as a railway expert."
"Oh, railways. They're just a hobby. Is that why you've come?"
"I want to consult you on a delicate matter, Hazell. What I am going to say is quite private."
"Certainly."
"To cut matters short, a very important document has been stolen from our office. We have no proof, but are certain that this document is in the hands of the German ambassador. The ways of diplomacy make action difficult. If we were to demand the surrender of this paper, we should be met, I have no doubt, with a bland denial that it is in the ambassador's possession. Our secret agents have told us that Colonel von Kriegen, a messenger of the German embassy, has been ordered to start at midday with dispatches to Berlin. It's more than likely, in fact it's a dead certainty, that this document will be in his dispatches. Now, if it gets into the possession of the German Chancellery, there will be international trouble which might even land us in a continental war. If you can devise any means of preventing the transit of this dispatch, you would be rendering the country a real service."
"How is he likely to carry the document?"
"In his dispatch box, together with other papers, and his journey will be guarded by German secret police."
"My dear fellow, you have given me a hard nut to crack." Hazell lit a cigarette and smoked hard for a few minutes. Presently he asked Cotterell if the dispatch box had a handle.
"Of course," replied the Under-Secretary. "A leather handle. All the dispatch boxes of the German embassy are of the same pattern, about a foot long, 8 inches broad, and 5 inches deep, with a handle on the top, a dark green box."
Hazell's face lit up. "You haven't one exactly like it?" he asked.
"Yes, at my office."
"Will the key be with the Colonel?"
"Of course not. The ambassador here will lock it, and it will not be opened till it is in the hands of the Chancellor in Berlin."
Hazell jumped to his feet. "Cotterell, there's just one plan that occurs to me. It's a desperate one, and even if it succeeds, it will land me in prison." "In England?"
"Rather.
I'm not going to play any tricks on the continent. Now, suppose I am imprisoned, what would happen?" Cotterell said quietly,
"Oh, you'd escape."
"Very good. I shall want help. Have you got a knowing fellow whom you trust? He must be a sharp chap, mind."
"Yes, one of our private men, Bartlett."
"Good. There are just 2 hours before the Continental train starts. Wire Bartlett to meet you, and I'll write out instructions for you to give to him. The chances are terribly against us, and I can only do my best. I shall follow you to town by another train. What is this von Kriegen like?" Cotterell described him. "Good. Now, you must be off." 3/4 of an hour later, Hazell came out. He had put on a dark wig, black serge suit, and straw hat. A clerical collar completed the deception of a clergyman in semi-mufti. A military-looking man, his fair moustache strongly waxed, and carrying a dispatch box, walked down the platform beside the boat train. He selected a first-class compartment. 2 men followed him closely, but unobtrusively. One posted himself by the window and kept a steady lookout onto the platform. The guard had just put his whistle to his mouth when a man came running down the platform. It was only a clergyman, and the man at the window gave a smile. With a rush, the clergyman made for the compartment. Frantically, he threw his bag, umbrella, and papers into the carriage. The train had just begun to move.
"I thought I'd lost it," exclaimed the intruder, taking off his hat and wiping perspiration from his forehead. "It was a close shave. Oh, thank you," he added, as one of the men rather ungraciously picked up his bag and papers from the floor, at the same time eyeing him closely.
But Hazell, in his disguise, opened the Guardian with an easy air, looking round at his three companions in such a naturally inquisitive manner as to thoroughly disarm them. The Colonel lit a cigar and said, half apologetically, "I hope you don't mind smoking?"
"Oh, not at all," returned the clergyman with an amiable smile.
Hazell was beginning, as he read his paper, to take stock of his surroundings and the positions in which the three were seated. Immediately opposite sat Colonel von Kriegen, watchful and alert. Beside the Colonel was the precious dispatch-box. On the next seat, guarding the dispatch-box on that side, sat one of the secret police agents, while the other had placed himself next to Hazell and, consequently, opposite the box, which was thus thoroughly guarded at all points. The chances of carrying out his plan were very much against him. He had really hoped to secure a seat beside the box. After a bit, he looked out of the window, watching the country as they sped through it. Once, just as they were passing through a station, he leant his head out of the window. The three men exchanged glances. The Colonel smiled and shook his head. Hazell sat down, took out a cigarette, and placed it in his mouth. Then he began feeling in his waistcoat pocket for a match. As it was apparent that the clergyman could find no matches, the Colonel's politeness came to the front. "Can I offer you a light, sir?" "Oh, thanks," replied Hazell, shifting to the edge of his seat. "Perhaps I may take one from your cigar." Every action that followed had been most carefully thought out. As he leant over towards the German, he held the cigarette with the first and second fingers of his right hand, with the end of it in his mouth. He kept his eyes fixed on the Colonel's. Meanwhile, his left hand went out through the open window, dropped over the sill, remained there for a moment, then came back and crossed over the front of his body stealthily with the palm downwards. It was all over in a second before the three Germans had time to grasp what was happening. He had his face close to the Colonel's, and he had taken a puff at the cigarette, when suddenly his left hand swooped down on the handle of the dispatch-box. His right hand flew forward into the Colonel's face, and before the Colonel could recover, or either of the others take action, Hazell had tossed the dispatch-box out of the window. They were on him at once. He sprang up, back to the window, and made a little struggle, but the Colonel and one of the others had him on the seat in no time. Meanwhile, the third man had pulled the electric safety signal and looked back along the line. "I can see it!" he cried triumphantly. The whole affair had taken place so suddenly that the train began to pull up within 15 or 20 seconds. The guard was out of his van in an instant, running along beside the train. "What is it?" The agent beckoned him to come up. Heads were out of windows, and this matter was private, so the guard climbed onto the footboard. "A dispatch-box has been thrown out of the train," whispered the agent. "We have the man here, but we must get the case. It's only a little way back." "Very good, sir," replied the guard quietly, waving an arm towards the rear of the train. The train began to reverse, and very soon a small dark object could be seen alongside the rails. As they drew close, the guard held out his hand, motionless. The train stopped, and he jumped off. "Is this it?" "Yes," exclaimed the Colonel. "Thank you, guard. Here's something for your trouble. We'll hand the fellow to the police at Dovehalven." Colonel von Kriegen lit another cigar as the train went on, and looked at Hazell. "I'm afraid you didn't quite succeed, sir. Who put you up to this?" "I accept the entire responsibility," replied Hazell. "Failure and all. I have only one favour to ask. Will you allow me to eat my lunch?" "Oh, certainly," replied the Colonel. "I should like you to travel all the way with us, but international law prevents that." Hazell bowed, and the next moment was placidly consuming plasmon biscuits and drinking sterilized milk. "Try a diet of macaroni and Dutch cheese," were his last words to the Colonel. "They both help to build up the grey brain material. Useful in your position." When the train arrived at Dovehaven, Hazell was marched to the station. The superintendent looked at him curiously, but nothing was said. It was strange, however, that he was not locked up in an ordinary cell, but in a small room. It was also strange that the bar of the window was loose, and that no one was about when he dropped out of it that night. The German police, when they heard about it, smiled. Diplomatic affairs are peculiar, and they knew this particular criminal would never be caught. Meanwhile, the Colonel journeyed on to Berlin with a full assurance in his mind that the papers in his dispatch box were intact. He handed the latter over to the Chancellor, who, as a result of a cipher telegram, was eagerly expecting it. Somehow his key did not fit the lock.
"Colonel, this is not one of our boxes, surely."
The Colonel turned pale. Snatching up a knife, the Chancellor forced open the box, with a cry of dismay issuing from his lips as he drew out the contents. The current number of Punch, in which he figured in a cartoon, and a copy of the Standard, containing an article on foreign policy that had been carefully marked. It is needless to record the ensuing conversation between the Chancellor and Colonel von Kriegen. At about the time it was taking place, the German ambassador in London received by post the original dispatch box, and its contents minus the incriminating document, which now reposed safely in the Foreign Office. "How is it done?" said Hazell afterwards, when telling the story to a companion. "Oh, it was a pure trick, and I'd hardly expected to bring it off. Fortunately, Bartlett followed out all my instructions to the letter. I told him to wear an Inverness cloak, to provide himself with the duplicate dispatch box, very strong fishing twine, a snap hook, and a light walking stick with a forked bit of wire stuck in the end of it. Now, the only difficulty about his job was the presence of other travellers in his compartment, which had to be the compartment behind mine, but, as it happened, there were only 2 maiden ladies who simply thought him mad on fresh air. The cloak served for a double purpose, to hide the box and to conceal his movements from the occupants of his carriage when the time for action came. I was to let him know which side of the train was the sphere of action by putting my head out as we ran through eastward. He would then get to work accordingly. He had the snap hook tied to the end of the fishing line. By leaning out of the window and slinging this hook on the fork of his walking stick, he was able to reach it along the carriage and slip the hook over the handle outside my door, where it hung by its cord. He then dropped the stick and held the cord loosely in his right hand, the slack end ready to run out. This, you will observe, kept the hook hanging on my handle. With his left hand he drew the dispatch box from under his cloak and held it outside the carriage, ready to drop it instantly. Of course, he was standing all the time, with his head and shoulders out of the window. When I leant forward to light my cigarette, I slipped my left hand out of the window, found the hook, grasped it, and kept it open with one finger. You can guess the rest. I swung my left hand suddenly over the dispatch box, snapped the hook over the handle, and pitched it out of the window as lightly as possible. The same instant, Bartlett dropped the duplicate box from the train, grasped the line tightly as the real dispatch box flew out, and hauled it in hand over hand. We very soon had the dispatch box safely stowed under his cloak, and on reaching Dovehaven, took the next train back to town. Unluckily, I quite forgot to ask the police at Dovehaven to have a dish of lentils ready for me in my brief imprisonment, but they made me an exceedingly well-cooked tapioca pudding. Thrilling Stories of the Railway by V.L. Whitechurch was read by Benedict Cumberbatch. It was abridged and directed by Fiona Kelcher.